The Apache neighbor asked, "I want a baby." The rancher answered, "Me, a father." Jake had never been one to seek the company of others. The sprawling ranch in the Arizona desert was his sanctuary, a place where he could work in silence and solitude. The sun was often his only companion as he spent his days tending to cattle, mending fences, and maintaining the quiet rhythm of ranch life. His ranch was simple, yet it provided everything he needed. For Jake, life was all about routine: work hard, sleep hard, and repeat. He had never been much of a socializer. The few people in town who knew him spoke of him in passing, but Jake never stayed in one place long enough to build lasting relationships. There was no need for friends, no room for anything else but the land and his animals. That was the way he liked it. His past had shaped him this way, a man who had learned to stand alone. Isabella, on the other hand, was nothing like Jake. She lived just a few miles from his ranch on the other side of the hills in a small Apache community. Isabella had always been proud of her heritage. She was strong, determined, and deeply connected to the traditions of her people. Raised by her grandmother, she learned the old ways, the healing herbs, the songs of her ancestors, and the stories that tied her to the earth beneath her feet. Isabella had been married once to a man from her tribe, but he had passed away some years ago, leaving her alone. While she was not without family, she was haunted by the emptiness that came with not having a child of her own. In her culture, children were not just a blessing, they were the future. They were the ones who carried on the stories, the traditions, and the strength of the people. But despite her efforts, she had not been able to conceive. This aching desire for a child consumed her. Her community, while supportive, could not offer a solution. That's when she came up with an idea that seemed improbable, but in her heart she felt it was her only chance. Jake, the rancher. Isabella had seen him from a distance, the man who lived alone, working his land in solitude just like her. She had heard stories about him, the quiet rancher who never came into town, the man who kept to himself. She knew he was strong, resilient, and capable. She also knew that he had no family of his own. To Isabella, Jake seemed like the perfect candidate to help her fulfill her dream of becoming a mother. It wasn't love that brought Isabella to Jake's door that day, but a deep, almost desperate need. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Isabella believed that Jake's strength, his ruggedness, and his independence would make him the perfect father. She didn't want him as a partner in the traditional sense. She simply needed his help in bringing a new life into the world. One hot afternoon, as Jake worked in the fields, Isabella made her way up the dirt road leading to his ranch. She didn't knock on the door. Instead, she simply walked up to him as he was tending to his horses. Jake paused when he saw her approach, his brow furrowing slightly. It wasn't every day that someone came to see him, let alone a woman from the neighboring Apache community. He didn't know her well, but he had seen her around. Isabella's presence, though unexpected, didn't make Jake uncomfortable. He had dealt with difficult people in his life, but Isabella wasn't one of them. She was confident and direct, two traits Jake appreciated. "Jake," she called out to him, her voice steady. "I need your help." Jake raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to people asking him for help, especially not a woman from the other side of the hill. "What do you need?" he asked, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "I want a baby," Isabella said, her eyes unwavering as she looked at him. Jake stood still, stunned. He had heard her clearly, but he couldn't quite believe it. The words didn't make sense. A baby? From him? What was she asking for exactly? "Me, a father?" he asked, almost laughing at the thought. Isabella nodded slowly. "Yes, you." Jake's first instinct was to back away. This wasn't something he was prepared for, not by a long shot. He had never considered fatherhood. He had never even thought about having children, let alone becoming a father. He couldn't imagine raising a child, let alone raising one with someone he barely knew. "Why me?" Jake asked, still trying to process what she was asking. "I've tried everything," Isabella explained. My husband, he passed, and I've tried to have a child, but it hasn't worked. I need someone strong, someone who can help me. I know about you, Jake. I know you're capable. I need a child, and I believe you're the one who can help me have one." Jake looked at her with a mix of confusion and hesitation. "And you think I'm the right man for the job?" Isabella didn't flinch. "Yes," she replied simply. "I believe you are." Jake found himself at a loss for words. He didn't know how to respond. This was not something he had ever expected. He had always lived his life without much concern for what others thought. But this was different. This was personal. This was about creating life. "Look," Jake finally said, taking a step back. "I don't know what you're asking. I don't even know if I can do what you want. I don't even know if I'm cut out to be a father. Hell, I've never even raised a child." Isabella took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm not asking you to raise the child. I'm asking you to help me make one. I just need the seed of life. After that, I'll raise it. I'll do everything. But I want it to come from someone strong, someone who can give this child the strength it needs." Jake rubbed his neck, still not sure how to process her request. It was strange, foreign, and seemed impossible. Yet, there was something in Isabella's eyes that made him pause. It wasn't desperation, it was determination. She wasn't asking for a favor, she was asking for a chance. A chance for herself, for the child, and perhaps for something more. Isabella stood there, waiting for him to respond. The sun was high in the sky, the desert heat making the air shimmer in the distance. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, as if waiting for Jake's answer. Jake took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what was happening to him, but he knew that something was shifting. Something inside him was beginning to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to see the world in a different light. "All right," Jake said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "Let's talk about it." Isabella smiled, and in that moment, Jake knew that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. After that unexpected conversation, Jake found himself thinking about Isabella and her request in ways he never imagined. His mind kept going back to her words, "I want a baby." It seemed absurd at first. He couldn't wrap his head around it. He was a rancher, not a man suited for fatherhood, at least not in the way she was asking. He'd lived alone for most of his life, with no family, no children, and no real desire for them. But Isabella was different. She didn't ask out of desperation or need for love. There was something about her confidence, her quiet strength, that made Jake's usual resistance to new ideas begin to waver. He respected her, even admired her calmness in the face of such an unusual request. It wasn't like anything Jake had ever encountered before. He couldn't stop thinking about it. In the days that followed, Jake noticed Isabella visiting him more frequently. She didn't waste time with small talk or idle chatter. Instead, she helped him around the ranch, moving seamlessly from task to task. She tended to the horses with a steady hand, fixed the broken fence, and even helped with the cattle. She worked as hard as he did, without complaint or hesitation. It was clear to Jake that she wasn't just trying to be helpful. She was showing him that she wasn't someone who took shortcuts. She meant what she said. Isabella didn't bring up the baby again at first. Instead, she allowed the silence between them to grow comfortable, as if letting Jake come to terms with the idea in his own time. She had her reasons, she knew that. This wasn't just about getting pregnant. This was about creating a life, a connection, something that would carry on. And in her mind, Jake was the right man for that. Jake, however, was still grappling with the enormity of the situation. He wasn't used to being challenged in this way. In all his years of hard work and isolation, he had never been forced to confront his own sense of responsibility. But Isabella was different. She wasn't asking for something frivolous. She was asking for a future. One evening, as the sky turned shades of red and gold with the setting sun, Jake found himself sitting on his porch, watching Isabella as she worked with the cattle. She moved with an easy grace, guiding the animals into the barn with practiced hands. There was something about the way she did it, with such purpose and determination, that made Jake feel as though he was seeing her for the first time. "Why me?" he asked, the question escaping his lips before he could stop it. He hadn't intended to ask it again, but it was a question that needed an answer. Why had she chosen him? Isabella didn't stop what she was doing. She simply turned to look at him, her face calm but serious. "I've been around long enough to know what kind of man you are, Jake. You're strong, you're hardworking. You've got the land, the knowledge, and the stability that a child needs. You've lived through hardship and you've always come out the other side. You're the kind of man I want to help create life with." Jake rubbed his hand across his stubbled jaw, still uncertain. "But I don't know the first thing about being a father. Hell, I've never even had a family of my own. I'm not the man for the job." Isabella smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to ease the tension in the air. "Being a father isn't just about knowledge, Jake. It's about strength, stability, and heart. You've got all of those things. It's not about being perfect, it's about doing what's right. You've already proven you can do that. The rest will come naturally." Jake was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. Could he really do it? Could he really become the father she needed him to be? Over the next few weeks, Jake tried to keep his distance from the idea. He went back to his routine, focusing on his work as if it could push the thoughts of fatherhood from his mind. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more the idea of being a father crept into his thoughts. The image of a child, a little one running through the fields, laughing, calling him Dad, wouldn't leave him. It was in the quiet moments, late at night, when Jake lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, that the truth began to take shape. He thought about the life he had built for himself. It was simple, but it was his. He had never considered the possibility of someone else in it, someone to share it with. But now, the thought of a child, a new life, stirred something deep inside him. He realized he wasn't as opposed to the idea as he had once thought. Isabella didn't rush him. She gave him the space he needed, but there was always a quiet understanding between them. Whenever they worked together, she would talk about the traditions of her people, the importance of family and children, how a child was not just a bond between two people, but a tie to the past and the future. She spoke of the sacredness of life and how each child was a gift from the earth. Jake listened to her stories, and though he didn't fully understand them, he began to respect them. He could see how deeply she cared for the child she longed to have. She wasn't asking for something selfish. She was asking for something much bigger than herself, and that made him wonder if he was ready to help her. One day, as the fall weather began to settle in, Isabella came to Jake with a simple request. "Jake," she said quietly, "have you thought about it?" Jake hadn't made up his mind yet. He wasn't sure what the right answer was, but he knew that he couldn't keep avoiding the question. He needed to decide. "I've thought about it a lot," he said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I can do it, Isabella." Isabella didn't flinch at his words. She simply nodded, understanding. "I don't expect you to be perfect," she said. "I just need you to be willing to try, that's all." Jake looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw the depth of her determination. He saw how much she believed in him, how much she trusted him to help her bring this child into the world. And in that moment, Jake realized that maybe he could do it. Maybe, just maybe, he could be the father she needed. "All right," Jake said slowly, his voice steady but uncertain. "I'll help you. I don't know how this will turn out, but I'll help you." Isabella smiled, her eyes softening with gratitude. "Thank you, Jake." And in that moment, as the sky turned dark and the stars began to appear above them, Jake realized that this was the beginning of something he hadn't expected. A new life, a new responsibility, and a chance to be part of something much bigger than himself. Jake had agreed to help Isabella, but the idea of becoming a father still felt as distant and foreign to him as the stars that filled the desert sky at night. The ranch was always full of work, the cattle to tend, the fences to mend, the barn to clean. And now, in the back of his mind, he carried the growing weight of his new role. Becoming a father was something that scared him, something that felt beyond his capabilities. But Isabella's presence was constant. Every morning, she arrived at the ranch, as reliable as the rising sun. She had a quiet strength about her that Jake admired. When she first came to help him, it was with the intent to show him her dedication to the life they would build together. And she did that with every task, every conversation, every glance that seemed to remind him of the decision he had made. Isabella was patient. She never pushed Jake for more than he could give. She had a quiet faith in him that he didn't quite understand, but slowly it began to affect him. The walls around his heart, which he had built over years of solitude, began to crumble. For the first time in a long while, Jake was no longer just thinking about surviving. He was beginning to think about the future, not just his own, but the future of a child, a life that might one day call him father. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Jake started to realize that he couldn't keep avoiding the questions that had begun to plague him. Could he really take on the responsibility of raising a child? Would he be able to provide, not just in terms of food and shelter, but with love, guidance, and protection? These were the thoughts that kept him awake at night, staring up at the ceiling in the darkness of his room. Jake had always been self-reliant. He had been a lone wolf for as long as he could remember. He never relied on anyone for anything, and certainly never considered relying on someone else for something as serious as fatherhood. Yet now there was Isabella, steady and sure, offering him the chance to become part of something bigger than himself. She was asking for more than just a physical contribution. She was asking for his presence, his commitment, and his willingness to change. Isabella never demanded anything from him. She never pushed him to decide quickly, but her gentle encouragement made Jake reflect on what it would mean to raise a child. As he worked alongside her, Jake saw something in her that made him start to believe in his own ability to be a father. Her connection to the earth, to the land, to the cycles of nature. It was something he had never understood before. But as he watched her, day after day, tending to the animals, mending the fences, gathering herbs, and telling him stories of her people, he began to see the wisdom in her ways. Isabella would often tell him about her tribe's traditions. She spoke of how the land was sacred, how every child born was a continuation of their ancestors' legacy. To Isabella, raising a child wasn't just about love. It was about ensuring the survival of her people, the continuation of a way of life that had been passed down through generations. A child wasn't simply a gift. It was a responsibility that extended far beyond the immediate family. It was a connection to the past and a bridge to the future. At first, Jake didn't fully grasp what she meant, but as she shared more about her culture, he began to understand. There was no rush in her voice when she spoke, no pressure. She explained that the child they would bring into the world wouldn't just be a part of them. It would be a part of everything they believed in. A child was meant to grow, to learn, and to one day carry on the traditions of their people. As the weeks passed, Isabella's patience continued to amaze Jake. She never hurried him. She didn't constantly ask him when they would move forward with their plan. Instead, she allowed him the space to come to his own conclusions. It was clear to her that Jake was struggling with his own fears, and she respected that. She understood that it wasn't easy to accept a new role, especially one as life-changing as fatherhood. But she also knew that Jake was capable. She had faith in him, even if he didn't have faith in himself yet. Isabella's confidence in him began to shift something inside Jake. The man who had once believed that a child had no place in his life was now beginning to consider the possibility. He started to see fatherhood not as an impossible task, but as a new chapter, one that would bring meaning and purpose to his life. The work on the ranch, The endless days of manual labor had always been about survival. But raising a child, he realized, would be about more than just getting by. It would be about building something, creating a future that he could be proud of, something bigger than himself. One evening, as they worked together in the barn, Jake couldn't hold back any longer. He paused in the middle of moving hay bales, and Isabella looked up at him from across the room. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unsaid but felt in the air. "Isabella," Jake said, his voice rough, "I'm not sure I can do this. I don't know if I'm the right man for the job. You've got so much to offer, and He trailed off, running a hand through his hair, unsure how to continue. Isabella set down the tool she was holding and walked over to him. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, her presence strong and calm. After a moment, she spoke. "You don't have to be perfect, Jake," she said softly. "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for your willingness. That's all." Jake felt the weight of her words settle deep inside him. He had been so afraid of failing, so focused on what he didn't know, that he had overlooked what really mattered. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying, about being there when it counted, and about doing the best he could with the tools he had. "Maybe that's the problem," Jake said, looking up at her. "I don't know if I can be the man you need. I don't know if I can be a father." Isabella smiled, a warm, patient smile that made Jake feel like he wasn't alone in this. "You don't have to do it all on your own, Jake. We'll do it together." And in that moment, Jake realized that he wasn't in this alone. He didn't have to figure everything out by himself. With Isabella by his side, they would face whatever challenges came their way together. Jake knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be difficulties, moments of doubt and uncertainty. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt a sense of hope, a belief that, with Isabella's help, he could navigate this new path. Fatherhood, he now understood, wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being there, being present, and making the commitment to try. And that was something Jake could do. As they worked side by side in the barn that evening, with the soft evening light filtering through the cracks in the walls, Jake felt a shift inside him. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first met Isabella. He had started to change, to open up to the possibility of a new life, one that included not just himself, but a child, a new beginning. The future, which once seemed so uncertain, now seemed full of potential. And for the first time, Jake felt ready to embrace it. The months had passed in a blur of work, quiet conversations, and careful steps forward. Jake had come to know Isabella in a way he never thought possible. She wasn't just the woman who had asked him to help her create a family. She was now a companion, a partner, someone he could rely on, even when the future seemed uncertain. Jake's life on the ranch had changed slowly but surely. He had always been a man of routines, but now his days felt different. There was something more to them, a purpose beyond the cattle, beyond the fences, and beyond the long hours of hard work. Isabella's presence in his life was no longer something that felt out of place. It was something he had come to depend on. She had a way of making even the hardest tasks seem easier. Her laugh was light, and her spirit, though serious when it needed to be, was always warm and welcoming. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of red and purple, Jake found himself standing at the edge of the ranch, looking out over the land he had spent years working. The ranch was quiet, the wind gently rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. It was in these moments of stillness that Jake often found himself thinking about the decision he had made. He had agreed to help Isabella, but now that the time was drawing nearer, the weight of it all seemed much heavier. The thought of fatherhood had become real in ways he hadn't expected. He had never imagined himself as the kind of man to raise a child, but now, with Isabella beside him, he felt the stirrings of something he couldn't ignore. He had never wanted to be a part of something so big before. It scared him, to be honest. The responsibility, the uncertainty, the commitment, it all seemed like so much. Yet, every time he looked at Isabella, he felt a sense of peace. She had asked him for this, and despite his doubts, he had agreed. The question was no longer whether he could do it, but whether he was truly ready. Isabella had been patient with him. She never rushed him to make a decision. She never pressured him to be anything more than he was. In fact, her patience had been one of the most surprising things about her. She trusted him, and in turn, that trust began to change something inside him. It wasn't just about her request anymore. It was about the bond they had built, the connection they shared. Jake was beginning to understand that fatherhood wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about showing up, being there when it mattered, and learning as you went. The child was something neither of them had yet, but that feeling of something new and unknown was growing stronger each day. Isabella had taken care of everything. She had made sure that everything was in place for the child: a home, food, the basics of a good life. And now, Jake was beginning to realize that it wasn't about being prepared in the way he had always thought. It was about being ready to step forward, ready to try, and ready to make a life together. The moment of truth came one cool autumn evening. Jake had spent the entire day working in the fields, mending a fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. The air had a bite to it, and the first hints of winter were beginning to settle over the land. As he worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to the child, to the future. He wasn't sure what it would look like, but he knew that it was a future he wanted to be part of. When the work was done, he headed back to the house, his muscles sore from the long hours, but his mind more settled than it had been in weeks. Inside, he found Isabella in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal. The warmth from the stove filled the room, and the smell of fresh bread and stew made Jake's stomach rumble. He paused for a moment, watching her as she worked, and he realized how far they had come. "Isabella," Jake said, his voice firm but gentle, "I've been thinking about it." "About everything." She paused, looking up from the stove with a small smile. "And what have you decided?" Jake took a deep breath and walked over to her, his hands resting on the back of the chair. He wasn't sure how to say it, but he knew it had to be said. He had come to a decision. "I've decided that I'm ready," he said slowly. "I'm ready to do this, to be a father, to help you raise this child." For a moment, Isabella didn't speak. She simply stood there, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that took Jake by surprise. There was no surprise in her eyes, no hesitation. She had known. She had known all along that Jake would come to this decision in his own time. She smiled, the warmth in her eyes spreading to her face. "Thank you, Jake." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that neither of them could fully explain. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic moment, just a quiet understanding that this was the beginning of something new. Jake could feel the change within him, like the earth shifting beneath his feet. He wasn't the same man who had agreed to help Isabella months ago. The uncertainty and fear that had once held him back had started to fade, replaced by something else, a determination, a readiness, and perhaps even a sense of excitement. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ready to face it. Over the next few days, Jake and Isabella worked together to prepare for the arrival of their child. It wasn't just about the physical preparations, the crib, the clothes, the food. It was about the emotional preparations as well. Jake was learning what it meant to be present, to support Isabella not just with his actions but with his heart. They talked about what their child might be like, what kind of person they hoped to raise, and how they would share the responsibilities of parenthood. There were moments of laughter, moments of silence, and moments of deep connection. Jake found himself growing more comfortable with the idea of fatherhood. He was no longer afraid of what he couldn't control. Instead, he focused on what he could do. He could be there for Isabella. He could learn. He could try. And most importantly, he could give this child a life full of love, strength, and care. As the day of the child's birth drew closer, Jake found himself more and more excited. He wasn't sure if he was ready in the way he had once imagined. He didn't know what it would be like to hold a baby in his arms, to care for it, to raise it. But what he did know was that he was ready to take that step. He was ready to become the father he never thought he could be. The future was no longer something distant and uncertain. It was something that was happening right in front of him. And for the first time in his life, Jake felt like he was part of something bigger than just himself. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was going to be a father. Isabella, too, seemed ready. There was a calmness about her now, an ease in the way she moved through the days. She had always been the one who had kept everything together, but now, as they worked together, Jake could see that she, too, had found a sense of peace. She wasn't alone in this anymore. They were doing it together. As the night of the birth approached, the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The ranch, once a place of solitude, now felt like a home in the truest sense of the word. A home filled with love, promise, and the hope of a new beginning. Jake was ready. And with Isabella by his side, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. The air was cooler now, the nights longer, and a sense of change hung in the air. The day of the child's birth was finally near. Jake had never imagined this moment would come, a moment where his life would truly be shared with someone else. For all the time he had spent alone, for all the years he had lived without a family, he could feel that something deep inside him was shifting. It wasn't just about becoming a father. It was about becoming part of something greater than himself. It was about being present, being involved, and offering love and care in ways he had never thought possible. Isabella had been strong throughout the entire pregnancy, as steady as ever, with her quiet resolve. The days had passed slowly, but they had been filled with anticipation and preparation. Isabella had made sure everything was ready for the child. The crib was set up, the room prepared with soft blankets and toys, and the kitchen stocked with all the things they would need. But despite all the physical preparations, there was an emotional readiness that was still taking shape. Jake had spent hours thinking about what fatherhood would mean, and though he didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to step into this new chapter. He wasn't expecting to have all the knowledge or be perfect. He simply wanted to be there for Isabella and the child. Together, they would figure it out. The days had seemed to stretch on, each one leading them closer to the moment that would change everything. The ranch had a sense of peace now, a calm before the storm, as Jake thought. He had always been used to hard work, to the noise of animals and the rhythm of chores, but now there was a different kind of silence, a quiet that held the weight of anticipation. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the distant hills, Isabella called Jake over to her. She was standing by the door of the house, her hand resting gently on her stomach. She smiled at him, but there was a look of urgency in her eyes. "It's time," she said, her voice calm but with a knowing in it. "The baby is coming." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected it so soon, though he knew the time was near. He had heard stories from neighbors and family about the miracle of birth, but it had never seemed real until now. Suddenly, it felt as though the entire world had shifted. He rushed to Isabella's side, his mind racing, but his hands instinctively reached out to help her. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Isabella smiled again, this time with more warmth than he had seen in weeks. "I'm fine. I've been through this before," she said, her voice reassuring. "But I need you now, Jake. I need you with me." Jake nodded, his chest tight. He had never felt more unsure of himself than he did in that moment, but he also felt something else, determination. Isabella needed him, and no matter how scared he wasn't going to let her down. He had already made the decision to be part of this family. Now, he was going to prove it. They made their way to the small room where Isabella had set up a space for the child. It was simple, but filled with the warmth of anticipation. The room smelled of fresh linen and the herbs Isabella used for their medicine. It was a peaceful, calming space, and Jake found comfort in its quiet. Hours passed, and as the night deepened, Jake remained at Isabella's side, helping her through each contraction, offering her water, holding her hand when the pain seemed to come in waves. He could see the strength in her, how she remained calm and composed despite the pain. Isabella's patience and courage were contagious, and Jake found himself doing everything he could to make her comfortable. Through the long hours, Jake's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What was he doing? Could he really handle this? What if he wasn't good enough? But each time doubt crept in, he looked at Isabella and saw the trust in her eyes. She believed in him, and for that reason alone, he knew he had to believe in himself. He couldn't turn back now. This child was coming, and he was going to be a father. At some point during the night, just as the first light of dawn began to peek through the windows, Isabella gave one final push. The room was filled with the soft sound of a baby's first cry, and in that moment, Jake felt something he had never experienced before. It was as though the entire world had stopped spinning, as though everything, all the work, all the doubts, all the fears had led up to this one moment. Jake looked down at the tiny baby in Isabella's arms. He couldn't believe how small and fragile the child looked, how perfect it seemed. The baby was wrapped in a soft blanket, its tiny hands curled into fists, its face pink and wrinkled from the journey into the world. And there in that moment Jake felt something stir inside him, a sense of responsibility, of love and of awe. Isabella looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "It's a boy," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "We did it, Jake. We have our child." Jake knelt beside her, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite put into words. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the baby's tiny fingers. He had never known a love like this, a love so pure and raw. The child was his, their child, and in that moment, he knew that he would do whatever it took to protect him. For the first time in his life, Jake realized that his world had changed forever. The ranch, the land, the quiet solitude that had once been his everything, all of it suddenly seemed small in comparison to the life he had just witnessed. The child in his arms represented something more than just blood and bone. It represented the future, a new beginning. And Jake knew, deep in his heart, that he was ready for whatever came next. The next few days were a blur of activity. There were visitors from the nearby town, people offering congratulations and bringing food and supplies. Jake found himself surrounded by more people than he had ever been used to, but he didn't mind. He was beginning to see that this was part of what being a family meant: connection, support, love. As the days turned into weeks, Jake and Isabella settled into their new roles. Isabella continued to care for the baby, nursing him and tending to his needs. Jake, though still uncertain at times, was learning how to care for his son. He fed him, changed him, rocked him to sleep, and for the first time in his life he felt truly needed. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a family, a real family. The ranch, too, began to take on a new meaning. No longer was it just a place to work. It was a home, a place where his son would grow up, where memories would be made, and where a new generation would one day take over. As Jake stood on the porch one evening, looking out over the land, he felt a deep sense of pride. He was a father now, and everything he had worked for had led him to this moment. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready. Isabella joined him outside, holding their son in her arms. Together, they watched the sun set over the desert, its colors spilling across the sky. The world around them was still, peaceful, and full of promise. "We did it," Jake said, his voice low with emotion. Isabella smiled and nodded. "Yes, we did." And in that moment, as the stars began to fill the sky, Jake knew that this was just the beginning of something beautiful, a family, a future, and a love that would last for generations.